In this video, we're going to learn how the relative price elasticity of demand for different goods affects the way a tax on that good will affect producers, consumers, and the government, which is trying to raise revenue through the taxation of different goods. We're talking about taxes on particular goods and services known as excise taxes. An excise tax is placed on a particular good. We're talking about what we call specific per unit taxes. Per unit means that these taxes are applied to every unit of a good that is sold. For example, in the market for gasoline, this might be a per gallon tax. And in the market for luxury goods, this might be a tax on each handbag. So for every gallon of gasoline sold, in other words, per unit, there will be a specific amount taxed. Specific means a particular dollar value. A tax of a particular dollar value being applied to each unit of different goods being sold. With that information in mind, we can go down to our graphs and look at the difference between the two goods that we've selected to analyze in this video. On the left, we have a good for which demand is highly inelastic. We know that PED for necessity goods with few substitutes like gasoline tends to be highly inelastic, which is reflected in the relatively steep demand curve here. The relatively steep demand curve of gasoline compared to that of luxury handbags represents the fact that demand is relatively inelastic for this necessity with very few substitutes. Luxury goods, on the other hand, are not necessities, they are pure luxuries, and demand for luxury goods tends to be relatively elastic, in other words, greater than 1, which is reflected in the relatively flat demand curve of handbags compared to that for gasoline. Notice that in both of our graphs we have a market that is currently in equilibrium at PE and QE. So over here we have PE for handbags and QE for handbags. What will happen when a tax of a particular amount is placed on both of these goods? Recall from an earlier unit that taxation is a determinant of supply for a good. A tax is a payment that must be paid from producers to the government for each unit produced. Therefore, it has the effect of shifting the supply curve inwards, or graphically it's going to look like the supply curve is shifting upwards by the amount of the tax. So if there is a tax of, say, $1 placed on each gallon of gasoline, this is going to have the effect of shifting the supply of gasoline curve upwards by $1. And at every quantity that producers sell, they'll have to pay $1 to the government. So the supply curve following the imposition of the tax is going to lie above the original supply curve, vertically $1 above. So our supply with tax is above the original supply curve by the vertical amount of $1. In the market for luxury handbags, if a tax is imposed, it will likewise shift the supply curve upwards by the amount of the tax. So at every quantity that producers sell, they must pay the government the amount of tax times the quantity that they're selling. So the supply curve will shift up for luxury handbags. Now normally we would say the supply is shifting in as a result of a decrease in supply. But when talking about taxes, it's useful to think of this as a vertical shift because this represents the marginal cost of handbags and the marginal cost of gasoline. Therefore, a tax is adding to the marginal cost that producers face. So now we can move on to our analysis of the consequences of a tax on a good based on the relatively inelastic or elastic demand for that good. Let's start with gasoline. Notice that the increase in the cost or the decrease in supply of gasoline causes the equilibrium price of gasoline to rise. We can call this PET, the equilibrium price with the tax, and the equilibrium quantity to fall. The higher price reduces the quantity demanded of gasoline. We'll call this QET. And not surprisingly, the tax on handbags also causes the price of handbags to rise to PET, and the quantity of handbags demanded falls to QET. Now let's go into a little bit more detail about the effect of this tax. A tax must create revenue for the government. So how do we identify the area of tax revenue that each of these taxes is generating for the government? Well, recall that the amount of the tax per unit is the vertical distance between the two supply curves. Supply was shifted upwards by the amount of the tax. We had that upward shift by the amount of the tax. Therefore, if we looked at the equilibrium price that consumers are paying, we can determine how much of that price, which is the vertical distance here from $0 to PET, this is dollars, how much of that is actually going to the government in tax? Well, we need to subtract out the vertical distance between the two supply curves. So if I go back over to my intersection point, my equilibrium point here, and I go down to the original supply curve, that's the amount of the price that consumers pay that's going to go to the government in the form of a tax. So I'm going to put another little price down here. Let's get rid of this. Let's now subtract the tax that consumers pay, and what is left is what we can call PP. This is the price that producers get to keep. This is what producers get to keep after paying the government. The PP represents the price producers actually get to keep. Now here we get into something really interesting. The price of gasoline does not increase by the full amount of the per unit tax. The price of gasoline increases by something less than that amount, whereas the price that producers, the gas stations themselves, actually get to keep decreases as well. So consumers bear a portion of the burden of the tax. In fact, I can shade the area representing what we call the consumer tax burden. I'm doing that in orange here. This is called the consumer tax burden. And we can shade the area of what we call the producer tax burden, the proportion of the total tax paid to the government paid by producers. And that purple shaded rectangle represents the producer tax burden, which I've labeled producers. Notice that when there is a tax on an inelastic good such as gasoline, the rectangle representing the proportion of the tax paid by consumers will be larger than the rectangle representing the proportion of the tax paid by producers. We'll come back to that explanation in just a moment. Let's now look over at a luxury handbag market. Notice that the price of luxury handbags goes up, but not by as much as that for gasoline. On the other hand, the price that producers actually get to keep, which you'll recall, you subtract from PET the vertical distance between the two supply curves, which I can do by going over to my equilibrium point and down to the original supply curve, draw my dotted line over here, and here's the price producers get to keep. So subtract the tax from PET, and I get PP. This is the price producers get to keep after paying the government. Here we can see that the producers' tax burden, which I'm shading in white here, is considerably larger. Call that producer burden. Is considerably larger than the consumer tax burden on an elastic good. The blue shaded area represents the consumer tax burden. And there's a considerably larger decrease in quantity demanded when the tax is placed on luxury handbags relative to the decrease in quantity demanded when taxing gasoline. So what have we observed here? Let's take some notes at the bottom here. First of all, a tax on a relatively inelastic good will be paid mostly by consumers. The consumer tax burden will be larger than the producer tax burden. However, when a tax is placed on a good with a relatively elastic demand, the burden of that tax will be paid mostly by producers, whereas consumers will bear a smaller burden. By applying our knowledge of price elasticity of demand, we can understand these two results of our analysis. Because demand for gasoline is highly inelastic, producers are able to pass most of the burden of the tax on to consumers. The increase in price that consumers pay is much larger than the decrease in price that producers get to keep because demand is so inelastic. If PED is less than 1, consumers will bear the larger burden. In fact, that's over here. If PED is less than 1, consumers bear the larger burden. On the other hand, a tax on an elastic good, producers cannot afford to pass most of the tax on to consumers. If they raise the price by much more than they have already in this illustration, you can see that the quantity demanded would quickly fall all the way to 0, and there would be no more market for luxury goods. Therefore, rather than passing most of the tax on to consumers, producers of elastic goods will bear the larger burden of the tax by accepting a lower price following the imposition of the tax. So when the price elasticity of demand is greater than 1, producers will bear the larger burden of the tax. Now, one final point of analysis I want to do in this video. Which type of good will generate the most tax revenue for government? Taxes on inelastic goods like gasoline or taxes on luxury goods like handbags? Well, that's a pretty easy question to answer. All we have to do is look at the total size of the rectangles in these two graphs. I'm going to outline those in orange. So if I outline the total size of the rectangle representing the consumer tax burden and the producer tax burden, I get the total tax revenue. This is the total tax revenue generated by a tax on gasoline. And in this graph, I can see the total tax revenue as the sum of the consumer burden and the producer burden. So in orange, I've outlined the tax revenue. And all we have to do is look at those two rectangles and say, well, which one appears larger and why? The tax revenue generated from an inelastic good will be greater. So we can say there's more tax revenue when taxing an inelastic good compared to an elastic good, which will have less tax revenue. And the reason for this is that taxing an inelastic good will have a smaller impact on the quantity sold than taxing an elastic good. So governments, policymakers, those in charge of determining who pays taxes and how the government collects tax revenues should consider the price elasticity of demand for different goods when deciding what types of goods to tax. Taxing elastic goods will discourage consumption of those goods and will create unemployment in the industries manufacturing those goods. However, they'll be very ineffective at producing tax revenue. Whereas taxing inelastic goods like gasoline will have a relatively small impact on the quantity demanded, therefore will not heavily impact employment in those industries, and will create much benefit for the government in terms of a larger area of tax revenue.